Pokemon Emerald Imperium is basically Radical Red and Hoenn, with Pokemon from every generation, new Mega Evolutions, and some of the craziest boss teams I've ever seen. So of course I had to attempt a Hardcore Nuzlocke, meaning if any of my Pokemon should faint, they'll have to be boxed forever. Professor Birch has finally learned to give out starters inside his lab after the Poochyena incident of '02. Let's just say it's a good thing he already had kids. He gives us a choice between any starter of all time. This is a big choice where I want something solid for the early game, so I go for the OG numero uno Bulbasaur. With Grass and Poison, we're super effective against Roxanne and resist both Brawly and Wattson. Bulbasaur is also the only grass starter that gets a Leech Seed at a super early level, which I think could be really helpful. So with my new partner in crime, I set off to pick up some encounters. In a Nuzlocke challenge, you only get the chance to catch the first Pokemon you run into on any route. This means how good your team ends up being is kinda down to luck. Our first encounter, a Alolan Meowth, is pretty decent. With Technician, it can output some decent damage with Fake Out and Bite, but it doesn't give us any great coverage or resistances going into the first few gyms. I next head north to Route 103, where there's a lot of great stuff we could get, and honestly, Krogunk is pretty good. With fighting for Roxanne and Poison to resist Brawly, this thing is a welcome addition to the team. But not as welcome as our Route 102 encounter, Phanpy. While Ralts is probably better later in the game, this thing is an early game menace. I continue towards Rustboro through Route 104. Getting Teddiursa or Gossifleur here would have been insane, but it's really hard to complain about Starly's early evolution and access to Intimidate. Continuing onwards, I find another flying type in Petalburg Woods in Tailo, and Guts Tailo is basically the best encounter you can get in base Emerald, at least certainly better than what I find on Route 216. It's a Skitty. This is a 5% encounter, so you decide if I'm really lucky or really unlucky. Before Roxanne, there are two major fights, the first one being versus Dawn, who's a new rival in this game. She doesn't put up too much of a fight in this battle, but with one look at her future team members, I knew this girl was gonna be trouble. But Dawn isn't the only visitor from Sinnoh. In fact, every Sinnoh gym leader has been programmed into the game, and beating them gives you some awesome rewards. The only battle that's mandatory is the one versus Rourke. The other Sinnoh leaders have some pretty insane teams. Comparatively, Rourke's Shieldon, Cranidos, and Tyrant aren't super scary, and in my case, Phanpy is pretty much just a hard counter against every single one of his team members. All I do is spam Magnitude to send him on his merry way. The only encounter left I can pick up before Roxanne is in Rusturf Tunnel, where I pick up a Geodude. Roxanne only has 4 Pokemon, which is a welcome start to a difficulty Romhack where they tend to have a full team of 6. Her lead Rhyhorn does have a Rindoberry to reduce Grass-type damage, but with its mere 30 base special defense and being quad weak to Grass, it still goes down to a Magical Leaf. Gligar comes in second, threatening Shrufus with a Wing Attack. This Gligar has Sand Veil instead of Hyper Cutter, so I'm able to drop its attack with Intimidate and then pivot out of Zinnia into Lulu, who still takes a ton of damage from a -1 Wing Attack. You'd think a quad effective Ice Shard would do more than half, but Gligar's massive defense of 105 means it doesn't even go below 50%, but it thankfully stays within range of a third Ice Shard after it heals up with an Oranberry. And speaking of Oranberries, Lulu pulls off the epic double Oranberry heal in a single turn by not quite healing above half with the first Oranberry, finding one with the pickup proc at the end of turn, and immediately eating it for more healing. Another Ice Shard then destroys Gligar, which brings in Wooper. Paldean Wooper can't really deal any damage to Phanpy, so it just goes for Yawn as I take it out with Magnitude. Roxanne's final Pokemon is Nosepass, and I don't want to be put to sleep by Yawn, so I swap out into Zinnia to get an Intimidate drop, which works out perfectly since Nosepass wants to go for Bulldoze for the most possible damage against Lulu. Nosepass most likely wants to Thunder Wave Zinnia since it can't quite take her out with a single Rock Tomb after Intimidate. Either way, even if it goes for Rock Tomb, we're perfectly fine swapping in Animar, who then baits Bulldoze. This loop basically lets us farm Intimidates until Nosepass is at -6 attack, making it as safe as it can possibly be to bring back in Lulu. I end up getting unlucky with low power Magnitudes the first couple of turns, but eventually I roll an 8, taking out the Nosepass for our very first gym badge. But the fights only get more difficult from here.
Round 2, fight!
As we make our way back through Petalburg Woods to meet up with Mr. Briny, we can cut down this tree to fight Gardenia. Her team before Wattson isn't too scary, especially since Dolliv and her 2 Glooms get completely walled by Ivysaur. With Leech Seed and Mega Drain, Sudowoodo's pretty manageable for Ivysaur as well, which means Roserade is pretty much the only threat on the team. As long as she doesn't get crit, Zinnia always survives a Sludge, even if she gets poisoned. A Wing Attack, Quick Attack combo with a held Sharpbeak is then enough to take Roserade out, but Zinnia just gets the crit for an easy KO. I then let Shrufus take out the Gloom Zundoliv, shoot my seed on the Pseudo-Wudo, and do a bit of strategic switching for some Leech Seed damage to put it in range of Soft Sand Bulldoze. Defeating Gardenia is huge, since she gives us the amazing TM for U-Turn, and more importantly the Eviolite to power up our mostly not fully evolved Pokemon. I then make the preparations I can by evolving Tailo and Phanpy, and if you decide to play this game, I definitely recommend you go talk to this guy in Petalburg to pick up the Old Rod. This gives you an additional encounter in Petalburg, Dewford, Route 115, Route 117. Do yourself a favor and get this man's rod wet, because I didn't know how to get the Old Rod in this game, so I just missed out on the encounters. Instead, I had to just go into the Brawly fight with what I had. And Brawly's honestly one of the scarier fights in the game. At this point, you don't have access to a ton of encounters, so you're really at the mercy of the few encounter locations that you've got access to. Later in the game, there are a ton of great gift Pokemon and eggs you can pick up, but at this point, you're very limited. Even after taking almost half of our health from Pikachu, we're never dead to crit from Sandslash, and after getting some health back from an Oranberry, we still managed to make it out of crit range. A Bulldoze deals massive damage, and the speed drop means we're faster next turn, which guarantees that Sandslash uses Ice Shard. Because of that Oranberry, high roll crit leaves us at 2 HP, so I can safely stay in and finish off Brawly's biggest threat with Bulldoze. Unfortunately, Lulu is at such low HP that it basically means we can't use our best tank for the rest of the fight. Donphan basically destroys his Lycanroc Dusk, which is kind of a shame since the rest of our team is incredibly weak to it. After switching in Zinnia for an Intimidate, I stay in and go for a Pluck just to get rid of Hariyama's Citrus Berry, and things start getting kinda scary as Hariyama sets up its second Bulk Up. 4 out of 5 of our Pokemon are physical attackers and are thus basically not going to do any damage to this thing after so many defense boosts. So I send in my only special attacker who doesn't quite take half from a low sweep, and because Hariyama's HP stat is so massive, we get a ton of HP back at the end of the turn from Leech Seed. And the fact that we're at full health makes Brawly extremely greedy with the Bulk Up boosts, and we basically just take out Hariyama for free. This is where things get extremely sketchy, since I decide to just stay in and risk a crit since nothing wants to swap in on this Fire Punch. A held Oranberry makes it so that I at least wouldn't have died to burn, but don't get me wrong, this is very sketchy territory. I take this risk since we're still so early in the game and a reset wouldn't be too painful, the payoff being to set up Leech Seed. From here I switch to Zinnia, who can get off an Intimidate to lower Girder's attack, which means Fire Punch doesn't do too much damage. After Leech Seed, there's no way we can survive a Thunder Punch, so I go for U-Turn thinking I'm gonna swap in Donphan, but because Brawly uses his turn to hard switch to Lycanroc, the U-Turn gives me a free swap into Glarb. Now the following is a very risky strategy, but it's kind of all I can do. A crit here would possibly lose me the run, but as long as Lycanroc doesn't crit, Glarb always survives and we knock it out with Revenge. Obviously, you really want to plan your Nuzlocke strategies around critical hits. It's just this early in the game, I don't have many options to work with. Brawly's final Pokemon is Girder, and I swap in Zinnia to get an Intimidate, but a critical hit here could have easily knocked out Zinnia too. Getting burned also means my U-Turn barely does any damage to this Eviolite monstrosity as I swap out into a Rabo. Sadly, I only brought my kitty because it's the most disposable member of the team, and I needed something to sack to swap in Glarb against Lycanroc. The only Pokemon I have left that's still at full HP is Ishai. Because the AI doesn't account for crits, it doesn't go for Thunder Punch and ends up lowering my speed with Low Sweep. This is perfect since our Aerial Ace damage guarantees that Girder goes for Mach Punch the next turn, and one final Aerial Ace finishes the job. This fight ended up going okay, but if I stick to strategies that are this iffy for the rest of the game, we won't get very far. After Brawly, I head to Granite Cave, where I really should have gotten my encounter before the gym. I turn off my Infinite Repel on the basement level, where I find a Gligar, which is awesome since it's one of my favorite Pokemon. But basically anything on this floor that isn't Woobat is an awesome pickup. Steven's room has some pretty awesome stuff too, but I really don't want to be stuck with the most likely Pikachu. I then set off with Mr. Briny and head for Slateport. Here I take on a gauntlet of trainers, but between Swellow for Heracross, Dryskin Krogunk for Azumarill, and Donphan for any other physical attacker, I pretty effortlessly claim my Charcadet, which I'd argue is a slightly better reward than the usual Soda Pop. In Slateport, we're also able to pick up every berry that reduces super effective damage, which could really come in handy. We then have our very first of many encounters with Team Aqua. We're Team Aqua, and we love the sea. That at least makes sense. They really shouldn't call it Team Magma if what they love is big anime tip. Anyway, we head north to Route 110, where we're hoping to pick up anything that's electric type, and Shinx, with its added dark typing, access to Intimidate, and new Mega Evolution, is a fantastic fantastic find. The only big mandatory fight between us and Wattson is the first fight versus May on Route 110. In this fight, she does have some really strong Pokemon, but her best ones aren't in their final form, and my current box had counters for every single Pokemon on our team, making it a very minor bump on our road to Wattson. I'm terrified of the fact that she'll have an Urshifu and Mega Blaziken, but for now, she's not a problem. After the fight, she gives us some great items like weakness policies and air balloons, as well as Flame Orb and Toxic Orbs, which are super helpful for Pokemon like Swellow and Gliscor. Defeating her also raises the level cap to 34, meaning we can evolve both Staraptor and Luxio into Luxray. Wait a minute, the road to Verdanturf is being blocked by Phoebe's sister Ursula?
I understood that reference.
Before we take on Wattson, we've got the option to face Fantina, which would give us some pretty awesome items and TMs. But considering how stacked this team is, I don't think we have what it takes to beat it. Because we get the rewards whenever we beat her, and our team never changes, there's really no point in risking it and taking her on right now. Instead, I pick up my final pre-Wattson encounter on Route 117, which could have been a Scyther, Heracross, even Pinsir, but I get the 4% encounter, Volbeat, which I wasn't too excited about because it's a Volbeat. Little did I know they'd actually made Volbeat part electric type, which makes it insanely viable for Wattson. And Wattson is where Emerald Imperium starts to get really serious. From this point onwards, basically every boss fight, including rivals, evil team fights, and gym leaders all have mega evolutions, so we've got to play very intentionally. Thankfully, Alila is perfectly positioned to take on Dedenne. With Struggle Bug, we can lower Dedenne's special attack so that we barely take any damage. Realizing that it's futile to stay in, Wattson swaps out into Magneton, but since we get off a free Struggle Bug on the switch, and a second one before it gets to hit me with Tri-Attack, we actually end up having more HP left after Citrus Berry than before Magneton hit us. This causes Wattson to switch again, but he kinda just runs into the same problem as Dedenne gets hit by a Struggle Bug as soon as it swaps in. Running out of HP isn't an issue for Volbeat either, since we can always heal back up at the start of the turn with Prankster Moonlight. Wattson switches to Magneton a second time and just gets Struggle Bugged again. Because I know it's gonna go for -1 Tri-Attack, I can swap out into Zinnia, and as long as I don't get status, close combat is an easy KO. Kilowattrel comes out next to outspeed me, so I swap into Animar, who gets to take an Air Slash on the switch. I'm able to tank a crit the next turn, but obviously a flinch would be terrible. I actually connect and burn Kilowattrel's Charty Berry with a Rock Tomb to lower its speed. I then swap into Voja, as Kilowattrel unfortunately gains all that HP back with a Roost. Voja's in a pretty good position here, resisting all of Kilowattrel's damaging moves, but that doesn't make much of a difference when you just keep flinching every turn. A third Air Slash takes me below half and activates my Citrus Berry, after which Voja finally connects with a super effective Ice Fang to take Kilowattrel below half. This causes Kilowattrel to just spam Roost, which weakens the power of Ice Fang since it gets rid of Kilowattrel's flying type, so I switch it up and start going for Bite, which eventually takes down the bird. Dedenne comes back in, threatening with super effective Draining Kiss, so I swap into Alila and put Wattson back on the Struggle Bus. I make a really annoying mistake here by misclicking Moonlight a second turn in a row to barely heal back anything, burning my third PP of Moonlight for no reason whatsoever. As usual, Wattson eventually switches, this time sending in his Vikavolt. And to my surprise, a single Struggle Bug does almost a quarter of Vikavolt's health. Wattson's pretty bummed about losing his special attack, so after a second Struggle Bug, he launches a Charge Beam. This neutralizes the special attack drop from Struggle Bug, but I'm fine with this trade since it barely does any damage to me. Once Struggle Bug takes him into the red, he switches it up for maximum damage and fires off a Bug Buzz. Not wanting to lose his Vikavolt, he swaps back into Dedenne to once again set up Electric Terrain, which gives me a free turn to heal up with Moonlight. I then go through the motions again and lower Dedenne's special attack with a Struggle Bug until Wattson feels it's time to swap out again, this time sending in his ace Luxray. This once again gives me a free turn to go for Moonlight, using up my last PP. My strategy to deal with Luxray is Donphan, but I need it to be at full HP when I send it in so that Sturdy is intact and I never die to crit. And to get a free switch, I decide to let Alila go. But Volbeat, my GOAT, my MVP, ends up surviving a Psychic Fangs from Strongjaw Luxray with base 130 attack. Just in case it survived, I went for U-turn, saving Volbeat for later and switching in Lulu for free. Getting hit by Ice Fang activates my weakness policy to double Lulu's attack, making it a guaranteed KO with Stomping Tantrum to finish off the Luxray. Vikavolt comes back in, but Volbeat's done such a good job leaving it in the red that a simple Ice Shard finishes it off. This just leaves Dedenne, so I swap into Shrufus, who's been waiting this whole time to destroy the mouse with Sludge. What an absolute performance from Volbeat, who's definitely earned my respect. Defeating Wattson gets us the luck site, which would be useful if we had a Mega Ring yet. It also raises our level cap to 47, meaning most of our Pokemon now become fully evolved. For our Pokemon that don't evolve by level up, we've got the shop in Verdant Turf where we can buy basically any evolution item in the entire game, so we can evolve Animar into Golem with a link cable, and Purphoros into my preferred evolution Ceruledge with a Moonstone. In Verdant Turf, we also find Phoebe's sister Ursula again, who will give us a bunch of great TMs if we can just beat her in a Pokemon battle. Thankfully, this is extremely easy, but only because Volbeat is an absolute monster. Because neither of the Oricorios see a kill on either of my Pokemon, they both go for Quiver Dance, which could be extremely dangerous in a run killer if you don't have a plan. Because of the Dancer ability, it's like both of the Oricorios get 2 Quiver Dances in one turn. But because of Volbeat, we've got a great way to deal with this. The first turn, I don't need Alila to do anything since I want the birds to dance. So I just waste a turn with Thunderbolt since Voja could have easily taken the bird out with a crunch alone. Turn 2 is where we execute the plan. Because the red bird has already danced, I lock it into Quiver Dance with Encore. I can do this faster than Oricorio because of Prankster, and then let Voja take care of the fresh Oricorio that just came in since it's gotta waste its turn Quiver Dancing. We then do the exact same thing to bird number 4, and bird number 2 is still locked into Quiver Dancing, so we just take it out for free turn 4. This then gives us access to a ton of great stat boosting TMs. Finally, I move north to Route 111, where Dawn's waiting to have a battle with us. Thankfully, this isn't much of a fight, since Purphoros completely walls Lopunny, and by baiting Chandelure to go for a fire move, Purphoros gets a free KO there as well. Her super tanky Mega Empoleon D can barely do anything to Shrufus, so I take the kill with Leech Seed and Mega Drain. After the fight, Dawn gives us some pretty awesome items in the TMs for Roost, Scald, and Flash Cannon. She also gives us the bulky Empoleon Mega Stone and a bunch of ability patches so we can change our Pokemon to get their hidden abilities. I then pass through Route 112, where there's a lot of great rare Pokemon we could get, but I end up rolling Houndour, which is fine since it has a Mega, but Dino, Hisuian, Sneasel, or Murkrow would have been way better. I have a similar thing happen in Fiery Path, where the best encounters are definitely the 1% Bagon or Dreepy, or the 4% Hisuian Growlithe. I guess I just have to consider myself lucky that my Salandit's actually female. Talking to this guy on Route 111 gets us a Riolu egg, so we just need to find an appropriate place to hatch it to make it a legitimate encounter. There's a bunch of great stuff we could get on Route 113, like Frigibax, Munchlax, or Cottony, but I end up with the laziest boy. Way earlier in the game, we were given 100 of each color of shard, and once we reach Fall Arbor Town, just like in Radical Red, we can trade these in for starter eggs, which is probably the most important encounter feature in the entire game. I start by hatching a grass egg in Fall Arbor Town and get one of my favorite grass starters, Sprigatito. With the ability patches from Dawn, I'm instantly able to give it Protean. With both Team Magma and the Fire Gym coming up, I get a few water eggs and start by hatching one in Oldale Town where we can't get an encounter anyway into Piplup. I then fly back to Rustboro and hatch a Poplio. On Dewford, I get the Hoenn All-Star Mudkip, and I hatch another water egg in Slateport where I get Froakie. With all these new starters, our box is looking really good, and there are pretty much enough locations in the game later that we can get any starters we want. Before we can take on Team Magma at Mount Chimney, I pass through 114 where I find a Sneasel. Because I've got access to both Razor Claws and Fangs, I evolve both my Gliscor and Weavile. I then make sure to use a Repel to delay my encounter in Meteor Falls since the later rooms that we can only access after Waterfall have some nutty encounters. Before we face Flannery, Team Magma's up to no good at Mount Chimney. This evil team encounter starts a nasty trend where we almost always have to face a double battle whenever we run into these guys. Thankfully, the only real threat in this first double fight is the Mega Centiskorch that's immune to rock because of its ability. Cradilly's Storm Drain also means you can't hit it with water type moves, so my only viable option to hit this thing super effectively is flying. Acrobatics only does about 97% at most, so I needed a Night Slash just to finish it off. Besides Mega Centiskorch, the only other real problem on the team is the Iron Thorns, but all I gotta do is U-turn with a Robo 2.0 to break Iron Thorns' air balloon, swapping in Animar who survives any hit with Sturdy, and let Lulu finish the job with a quad-effective Stomping Tantrum now that the Iron Thorns isn't floating in the air. And that double battle was much more of a headache than the boss fight versus Maxie. Being a single battle, there's just not as much to consider. The scariest thing on his team is his Specs Chi-Yu, but a quick switch to Purphoros, who's completely immune to Flamethrower, and we get to take it out without taking a single hit point of damage. The rest of his team offers almost no resistance whatsoever, giving us a nice clean victory. Before reaching Lava Ridge, we go down Jagged Pass where I pick up an Applin. I also decide it's time to take on Fantina to get that expert belt since I've got a much greater selection of Pokemon. With Protean Meowscarada, it's pretty easy to confuse confuse the opponent. Not exactly like Confuse Ray would, but you can bait the AI into pretty bad positions. Getting the Expert Belt and Leftovers is huge, since they can be useful throughout the entire game. We've got a lot of good Pokemon to deal with Flannery, but this fight is extremely difficult since she instantly sets up the sun. There's no way for us to get rid of this weather, except for if we would have gotten a Swablu. Unfortunately, we got a Sneasel instead, which isn't going to be very helpful against this gym. I lead with Lulu against her sun-setting Ninetales, and getting hit by a super effective Energy Ball triggers our weakness policy to double Lulu's attack, meaning we easily take Ninetales out with an Earthquake. This brings out her shiny Infernape, so I swap to Perforos to dodge any fire or fighting moves. Oddly, Flannery immediately switches her Infernape out into Rotom. I don't know why she'd change her mind and pivot instantly, but my counter for Rotom is Thrasios the Swampert. Before face tanking an Overheat from this thing, I want to make sure the sun's not up so that I don't die to crit. So before committing to any attacking moves, I make sure to alternate Protect and switching between Thrasios and Perforos to guarantee the non-sun boosted Overheat doesn't do over half. I start dealing damage with Rock Slide, but before I get to finish Rotom off, Flannery Pain Splits to heal up and then hard switches out into Walking Wake. She does swap right into a Flip Turn, giving me some offensive momentum and letting me swap into a Pokemon of my choice. Without the special attack boost from Photosynthesis, Walking Wake never does enough damage to take me out with crit here, so I can just stay in and blast it into oblivion with Moonblast. Rotom comes back in, so I switch to Thrasios and take it out with a Flip Turn. I send in Flubs, which baits back in Infernape. For those who don't know, in this game, Mega Infernape has 142 base speed, which is the same as Dragapult. Not only am I not outrunning that, it's got 137 in both of its attacking stats with adaptability. Thankfully, this thing only has Thunder Punch and Fire and Fighting moves, and I end up changing my strategy slightly here because my first Shadow Claw crits. After one Thunder Punch, I can still take a Thunder Punch crit, so I just stay in and take the Infernape out. My non-crit plan was a lot less elegant. I was just going to swap between Ceruledge and Donphan until Infernape ran out of Thunder Punches, at which point Ceruledge is immune to every single one of its moves. The only productive thing Torkoal can do to Ceruledge is Earth Power, which is why I gave Flubs an Air Balloon so that we can come in for free against an Earth Power and then U-turn out into Perforos again. Solar Beam looks really scary here, but we're able to take a crit no matter what. I then swap back into Flubs to dodge another Earth Power and U-turn into Animar. The switching around is just to stall as many Sun turns as possible. Now Animar is quad weak to Grass, so Sturdy saves us at 1 HP, and our weakness policy triggers to double our attack stat. And while Torkoal do be a chunky girl, a Headlong Rush at 120 base power with doubled attack is way more than enough to take her out. At the end of the turn, the Sunlight fades, which is perfect since Flannery's final Pokemon is Scovillain, which doesn't get its Chlorophyll boost. Because I can do a ton of damage with +2 Sucker Punch, I let Animar go here to get a safe switch. It was random move, but if I would have known it was Scorching Sands, I probably would have stayed in anyway, since the massive damage from Sucker Punch makes this a really easy victory. After beating Flannery, May gives us the Mega Ring, which gives us access to a lot of power. Because we haven't caught anything in Lava Ridge and can't receive any Pokemon, I decide to just hatch my Riolu egg. I then talk to the lady to get what's usually the Why Not egg in Base Emerald to hatch it into an Eevee in Mauville City. I don't evolve Eevee immediately since we can patch up our team with a typing that we desperately need for a fight in the future whenever we find out what that is. Usually, you can just walk up to Norman and challenge him at this point, but in this game, you've got to take on the Trick House. The Trick House is a boss rush of about 7 trainers that don't have full teams. We get to change up our team between every single fight, and with Mega Lucario and Mega Luxray, it really isn't that tough to beat them without losing a single Pokemon. To get Mega Lucario before the Trick House, I of course had to take on Maylene. With Poison Heal Gliscor holding leftovers, I could very easily stay healthy. The only super scary Pokemon on our team is her King Gambit, which she elected to send out last, meaning its Supreme Overlord ability made it very powerful. I basically had to put it to sleep, Leech Seed and Mega Drain for damage, and then swap into a Rabo and pray it stayed asleep. I could have survived one non-crit knockoff, but then I'd have to worry about Sucker Punch. I definitely underestimated Supreme Overlord, but hey, we got the Lucario Knight in the end. At some point in his life, every man's gotta confront his father. I just didn't know that I'd have to face a non-Truant 700 base stat total Vanilla Gorilla when the time came for me. That being said, having just acquired Mega Lucario, we're in a pretty good position versus a normal type gym leader. His first Pokemon is a Focus Sash Zoroark, so I U-turn out out with a Rabo to tank a hit with Perforos and then switch back to take a Bitter Malice, and we don't care about getting crit or getting Frostbite here since Frostbite is basically just burn but for special attacks. Heck, without the Focus Sash, we could have just taken it out with a Night Slash. Slacking comes out second, and because we changed into a Dark type with Protean, we're baiting Play Rough. If we can just swap in Lucario safely here, we're good to go. But because a Rabo is faster, I can't just U-turn out into it since I'll have to eat a Play Rough, which I won't survive if it crits. So my plan to bring Lucario in safely starts by sending in Perforos on a Play Rough, then swap to Atraxa since we're baiting an Earthquake. At full HP, Atraxa doesn't care about any crits, and we can U-turn at the end of the turn since we're slower, finally giving us our safe switch into Lucario. From here, we can outspeed and one-shot the monkey with an adaptability close combat, which brings in the second big threat, Iron Valiant. This is the final boss of Pokemon Violet, and the creator of this hack felt it was appropriate for the middle of the game. Atraxa takes a big critical hit on the switch, taking us down just below half HP, but with the health we get back from Poison Heal at the end of the turn, even a critical hit Spirit Break next turn would be fine. Because of the defense drop from close combat, an Acrobatics with no held item is a super guaranteed KO. Our next problem is Ursaluna, but because we're baiting Hyper Voice, we can easily swap in Ketramos to tank the hit. Ursaluna Blood Moon is super physically tanky, so I made sure to give Ketramos Aurasphere just for this matchup to take it out in one hit. Cyclizar does outspeed Mega Lucario, but with only resisted moves to hit us with, we're not under any threat and can take it out with a single close combat. This leaves Norman with no choice but to send in his final Pokemon Obstagoon, which of course falls to a quad-effective adaptability close combat. To start Winona Split, we've got to go to the desert to pick up the TM for Surf. I make sure to rappel my way to the top of Mirage Tower where there's a ton of great encounters we can get. And honestly, I can't complain about shiny Kangaskhan even though it's no Iron Valiant. Once the tower is gone, I pick up my encounter on Route 111, which ends up being a Rockruff. There's a few trainers before we reach the end of the desert where we pick up the HM for Surf, allowing us to start crossing the sea to start making our way towards Fortree. Once here, we can get a couple of encounters, starting on Route 118 where I find, Sentret. Not exactly a game-changing encounter, but it's cute, I guess. I then start going through the tall grass on Route 119 where I find a male Indeedee. This thing's hidden ability is Psychic Surge, which could come in handy if we're facing a different terrain team. Hey yous, please don't go near the Weather Institute. Maybe I wouldn't have to if you weren't blocking the way, you piece of shit. Team Aqua in the Weather Institute, unlike Team Magma on Mount Chimney, has a really dangerous double battle before the mini-boss. Team Magma only had 4 Pokemon, and the only real threat was Mega Centiskorch. In this Team Aqua double battle, we face a full team of 6, and the problems don't stop coming. Up to this point, I'd spent hours planning, but this was the first fight in the game where I spent more than an hour for a single fight. Mega Machamp is super threatening. Its ability is basically parental bond for punching moves, so we gotta get rid of it as fast as possible. Unfortunately, both of its defenses are super bulky, and I've gotta spend both of my actions to take it out with super effective moves. Armaldo sees a kill against a Rabo with Pin Missile, but that's when it was a grass type, and since we changed into Fairy to resist it, we don't even take half. I start the second turn by immediately knocking out the Ash Greninja with an Expert Belt boosted U-turn. As a Fairy type, Armaldo wanted to take out a Rabo with a Rock Blast, but I swap in Empoleon, who barely takes half as well. We've taken out 2 Pokemon on the right side, and because this counts as a multi-battle for the opponents, if we can take out Ogerpon, it's a 2 versus 1. I Mega Evolve Empoleon and U-turn out immediately with a Rabo to send in Atraxa. This way, I can tank both the Play Rough and the incoming Pin Missile. I swap out into a Rabo, and unfortunately after a Horn Leech, a Flash Cannon isn't enough to take Ogerpon out. Armaldo doesn't see a KO, so it just goes for Swords Dance, meaning I've gotta deal with that thing very soon. I take out Ogerpon with a U-turn, and at this point, the fight is a 2 against 1. A Scald burns Armaldo's Pasho Berry, and at this point, I was very much steering and just hoping I don't get taken out. Amazingly, the Scald manages to get a burn, cutting Armaldo's attack in half, without which I think I would have just lost Lulu here since 5 Pin Missiles does just over half. Because it's a multi-hit move, I wouldn't even have been saved by Sturdy, so Lulu's pretty lucky to be alive. Because Empoleon is faster than Armaldo, I just swap out into Bellow the Furret and take Armaldo out with a Scald. This brings in Starmie, so I swap out of Empoleon into Atraxa, since the only way Empoleon's getting hit is if I'm struck by Thunder. To my surprise, an Adaptability Extreme Speed actually does way over half, and Bellow survives a critical hit Psychic to finish Starmie off with an Extreme Speed the following turn. Unfortunately, this doesn't put us in the best position to fight the final Pokemon Iron Jugulus. And to make the fight as efficient as possible from this point, I go for Follow Me with Bellow to make sure that it goes down instead of Atraxa. I don't want to lose my Gliscor to a random crit, and with Bellow's sacrifice, I can guarantee that Iron Jugulus goes down the next turn to Lulu and a Rabo. I know I said Sentret wasn't going to be a super useful Pokemon, but it actually ended up saving everyone else. It may not be the strongest Pokemon, but it was exactly what I needed for this double battle. Compared to that double battle, taking care of Shelly was a piece of cake since single battles are way easier to prepare for. This means the only fight standing between us and Winona is another rival battle with May. With Sturdy, Lulu can always handle Metagross and Atraxa takes care of Crobat. Mega Blaziken can only touch Purphoros with Thunder Punch, meaning it's a free KO, and Purphoros just outspeeds Basculegion, making it a super free matchup since May always wants to switch it into us. Finally, her Whimsicott stands no chance against Purphoros, resisting all of its moves, making for a very easy victory. May gives us a Life Orb after the fight, which is probably the best item we have so far. Once we reach Fortree, we could easily just fight Winona, but the developers of the Romhack have placed themselves in a building in Fortree, and if you beat them, they give you one of the choice items respectively and a bunch of good TMs and Megastones. It is a big risk to take on 3 optionals, but these items are so good it would probably be worth trading half of our box for them. So, I was in. These 3 trainers have incredibly well-rounded team that'll really mess you up if you don't plan for them. The first one wants to ruin your life with Sticky Web, so I lead with Alila to first get off a Bug Buzz as it sets up its Sticky Web, which ends up getting a massive critical hit. I then lock Galvantula into Sticky Web by going for Encore, which causes Trainer X to swap out into Darmanitan as I defog away the web. Switching into this Life Orb Sheer Force Darmanitan is the only real test on this team. There just isn't a Pokemon I own in my box that can take a crit from this thing, so I basically just had to swap Lulu in, hope I don't get crit, and then take it out with an Earthquake. Thankfully, I can't be taken out by Burn here since Sheer Force eliminates the possibility of getting burned. Mega Torterra is extremely tanky and has the custom ability Ice Eater, making it completely immune to quad-effective Ice-type moves. Unfortunately for Trainer X, it basically gets completely walled by Atraxa, making this fight a piece of cake aside from the slight risk we took facing Darmanitan. The second trainer we take on is actually the creator of the hack, Irib24, who's done an amazing job making what's probably my favorite ROM hack of all time. I made sure to burn his Dragon Dancing Tyranitar with a wide lens on Purphoros so that Atraxa could deal with it. The most threatening Pokemon on his team is a Focus Sash Alakazam, so I outspeed it with a Rabo to take it down to his Sash and U-turn out into Purphoros to dodge a Focus Blast. This way I can finish off the Zam with a Shadow Sneak, bringing in his Mega Empoleon. Voja always survives a crit liquidation here, so I can just switch him in and go for a super effective Thunderfang to take it out from full health. I then let Shrufus deal with the final Florges, which means we've gotten ourselves a Choice Scarf along with our band. To finish our set of choice items, we've got to take on Trainer Cap. This was by far the easiest of the 3 fights where I really only took a risk with Voja against Celesteela. Purphoros almost perfectly walls Conkeldurr, and I make sure Atraxa finishes off Donphan with a U-turn so that I can swap in Lulu against Charizard at full health to guarantee we KO with an Earthquake Ice Shard combo. From there, I just had to click Earthquake against Lantern since I'm still at full HP and don't risk anything with Sturdy still intact, and complete my collection of choice items. Before taking on Winona, we've got to meet up with Steven and face the Kecleon on the bridge on Route 120. This would of course count as our encounter on Route 120, and I really wasn't too enamored with any of the encounters possible in the grass, so I elected to get a Fire-type starter egg and hatch it right on the border of Route 20, which gets me a Fennekin. I decide to hatch an egg in Fortree 2, getting me my Cyndaquil, which is an awesome encounter because of its custom ability, Blazing Soul. I then knock out the Kecleon, making it time to face the 6th gym leader, Winona. She leads with a Staraptor that we can easily outspeed with Flubs and take it out with a Protean and Life Orb boosted Ice Beam. As an Ice type, Frostmoth can't take me out in one hit, so I go for a U-turn into Lulu as it sets up with Quiver Dance. A +1 Ice Beam easily takes me down to 1 HP, and to make sure I don't die to Frostbite in case I get status, I've got a Citrus Berry. Sturdy guarantees I get to connect with Rock Tomb, which is 100% accurate in this game, so I don't have to worry about missing. Thundurus comes out third, and the only thing that could take out Donphan is Grass Knot, so I swap into a Rabo and go for a U-turn to deal a bit of damage as I swap in Voja. I eat a Sludge Wave on the switch, and after Voja Mega Evolves, it's faster than Thundurus, meaning I can easily take it out with a Strongjaw boosted Ice Fang. Aggron comes out fourth, so I swap out into Atraxa, who can eat basically anything this thing wants to throw at me, and then outspeed and take out Aggron with a quad effective Earthquake the next turn. The way I deal with this Life Orb Flygon is pretty suboptimal. I end up risking a Draco Meteor crit here, which is super unnecessary since I could just swap to Tatiova immediately and avoid the damage completely. On top of that, a quad effective Ice Fang doesn't even finish Flygon off, so I'm forced to swap in Tatiova next turn anyway. This way, I risk a second crit, and I should have just swapped to Tatiova immediately to avoid risking the first crit against Gliscor. If I were to play this fight again, I'd either give Tatiova an Air Balloon here for an easy KO with Ice Beam, or I would just swap between Tatiova and Gliscor to dodge Draco Meteor and Headlong Rush until it runs out of Draco Meteor PP completely, at which point Gliscor has no problem walling it. I think I was just overconfident from the developer battles, and honestly, I shouldn't have played this gym fight so recklessly. Flubs, however, is completely fine against Altaria. I'm never dead to crit Earthquake, so I can just double Ice Beam to take it out. If it crit, I wouldn't be able to afford a second Life Orb Ice Beam, but I'd just have to switch. With the Feather Badge in hand, we've got to make our way to Lily Cove, and on the way we find Rourke's dad, Byron. After assembling an appropriate team, we pretty much have to take this guy on since he gives the best reward of any Sinnoh gym leader. The guy immediately swaps his Skarmory for Poltegeist, which gets zapped by Aleela. Perforos basically walls Scizor, so Byron swaps it out, which gets his Melmetal burned on the switch. I use Bitter Blade for damage a few times until it's unsafe to stay in due to crit, and swap out into Atraxa, who can finish the job. Mega Lucario gets to handle both Orthworm and Skarmory before I switch to Lulu against Kappa-Raja, which just one-shots with an Earthquake. Finally, we've just got to deal with Scizor, who gets completely walled by Ketramos, who can finish the job with Aura Sphere. We get a lot of great stuff for beating Byron. First of all, the TM for Stealth Rock, the Rocky Helmet, and another set of leftovers. But the best reward of all is our very own Meltan. This thing's probably one of the best encounters in the game, if not the best guaranteed encounter. We next have to follow Team Aqua to Mount Pyre. There's a lot of great Pokemon we can get here, and I end up trying my luck on the very first floor since the most likely encounter at 20% is Dreepy. Making a great Pokemon like this the most likely encounter on a route is one of the reasons I really love this game. It really feels like every route gives you a pretty decent Pokemon that'll definitely help you out. Once we reach Lily Cove, we get the option to teach any of our Pokemon their egg moves. I then make sure to level up my box and evolve most of my Mons to make sure we've got the greatest selection possible for the upcoming fights. And we're gonna need it, because there are some really tough fights coming up. Before we get to go to Lily Cove, we've got to deal with Aqua Hideout. As one would expect, my encounter here ends up being an Electrode, and my attempt to catch this thing doesn't go very well. For me, or the Electrode, if we're perfectly honest. To prepare for our first showdown with Archie, I go and get myself a Thunderstone to evolve Eevee into my favorite evolution, Jolteon. Much like in Base Emerald, we've got to take on Archie twice, and the first fight is incomparable to the second. Between Volt Absorb and Resisting Flamethrower with Tatiova, I could very easily pivot around to take care of Electros. Jolteon is much faster than Mega Sharpedo, so the only thing it can do to get damage is Aqua Jet, which even after a critical hit, doesn't put Felia in range of being taken out by Iron Bundle because of her held Assault Vest. After our great victory, I finally get to go to Moss Deep City. What even are you, Mochi? Tell me your secrets. What makes Tate and Liza particularly difficult is their Choice Scarfed lead Iron Leaves that you can't outspeed with priority because of Tapu Lele's Psychic Terrain. So I slapped a Choice Scarf on a Rabo and went for the quad effective U-turn to instantly take it out before it gets to make a move. The only kill Tapu Lele sees is against a Rabo with Moonblast, so I make sure to U-turn out into Candice to quad resist the fairy hit. As an added bonus, Candice's poison typing means we'll bait Psychic type moves the next turn. At the end of the turn, Perforos picks off Tapu Lele, which brings in Espathra and Alakazam. I immediately swap Candice out for a Dark type to be immune to Psychic. From here, we definitely prefer if Mega Alakazam goes for Psyshock since we won't take any damage. The far worse option is its spread move Expanding Force, which obviously won't hit a Rabo, but Perforos takes a ton of damage. A critical hit here would be disastrous and just straight OHKO Perforos from full health, which is why we would have preferred to see Psyshock. Because Perforos survived, he gets to take out Alakazam with a Shadow Claw, and Espathra gains some speed at the end of the turn. As Farigiraf comes in, I hard switch out of Ceruledge into Weavile. And even though Espathra keeps gaining speed every turn, I target the Farigiraf since if we can defeat it, this'll be a 2v1 fight. I swap into Candice in case they go for fairy type moves, but both Tate and Liza target Braids with psychic attacks. Dazzling Gleam isn't enough to one-shot Braids without a crit, so I expect both of my opponents to target Candice. By swapping into a Rabo, I get a free turn to get off a Night Slash, which doesn't quite do enough to take out Espathra. I'm now expecting Espathra to target Braids with Flash Cannon, so I swap in Candice. The resisted hit barely does any damage at all, and I can U-turn to take care of Espathra before Farigiraf gets to Dazzling Gleam. My plan to make this fight a 2v1 didn't quite work out since I'm now facing their last two Pokemon as a 2v2. If I stay in with Salazzle, she's definitely gonna get destroyed by a Psychic from Farigiraf, but because I can outspeed both of the opponents, I decide to stay in and go for a Will-O-Wisp anyway to power down Kangaskhan. Fog is kinda just here in case I needed something to sack, so I end up setting up Tailwind before Farigiraf destroys Candice. To replace her, I send in Voja, who outspeeds everything even without Tailwind and can take out Farigiraf before it gets to move. Fog then sets up a substitute, and Kangaskhan can't even break the sub because of my Chople Berry. I go for a crunch with Voja to get as much damage as possible, knowing it won't take Kangaskhan out. I disable Kangaskhan's power-up punch, but it switches it up for Brick Break to just break my sub. This means both Fog and Voja end up surviving as I take out the Mega Kangaskhan with a final crunch to get our 7th gym badge. Moving into the final gym split, I start by taking on Candice outside of Shoal Cave. With Ice being by far the weakest type in the game, this doesn't end up being much of a fight. Typhlosion one-shots Vanillux, and Melmetal takes care of Baxcalibur. Galarian Slowking can't touch Empoleon, but this brings out the real threat of her team, Xian Pao. With a Choice Band, it ends up locking itself into Sacred Sword as I swap into Purphoros, allowing me to get it burned before she swaps into Glalie, which instantly gets destroyed by Bitter Blade. Once it comes back in, I swap out into a Rabo to resist the Throat Chop and outspeed the next turn to knock it out with a quad-effective Brick Break. I then swap to Lucario versus her final Glaceon, tanking a Freeze Dry and taking it out with a close combat. The reason defeating Candice is so important isn't the fact that she gives us Blizzard and Triple Axle, but because she gets out of the way of Shoal Cave, where the only encounter you can get is one of the many Paradox Pokemon. If you end up getting the 10% Fluttermane or 5% Roaring Moon, you're in good shape. I don't end up being quite so lucky, but I certainly won't complain about walking Wake. This brings us to Magma Hideout and the true start of the endgame. Both Magma Hideout and Seafloor Cavern have very similar boss setups. You first have to take on the two admins back to back. With 4 Pokemon each, this basically means you're fighting a 6v8. My first fight versus Courtney went off without complication, Volt switching out into Miram as she hard switches into Komodo, giving me a free chance to take it out with Dragon Darts. Atraxa then walls both Talonflame and Mega Centiskorch, taking them both out, but at the cost of a great deal of HP. Typhlosion unfortunately gets paralyzed as I swap into Serperior and take it out with a final burn-up. The paralysis and all that damage to Gliscor puts me in a pretty precarious position as I go into the fight versus Matt. His lead Pawmot is a big threat, and I manage to Volt Switch out into Purphoros and get it burned before it does too much damage. Then as I switch into Atraxa, he switches out himself into Houndoom. Without any good options to switch to, I send in Philia, who takes a ton of damage from Fiery Wrath, bringing me all the way down to just 11 HP. I then go for Volt Switch, forgetting I gave Philia a Life Orb.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Miram comes in and can outspeed and finish the job with a couple of Dragon Darts, but this brings in Big Emboar, which custom ability is Bull Rush, which frankly is bullshit. At least in my current situation, where Miram has no way to deal with this thing in one hit, and basically anything I switch to is pretty much doomed. I swap in Atraxa, who can survive anything but a head smash, which sadly is how she meets her ultimate end. Ironically, her sacrifice is the only way we win without losing more Pokemon. The recoil and Life Orb damage makes it so that Dragon Darts is enough to take it out from this amount of HP. Hydreigon comes in next, which gets promptly destroyed by Dragon Darts, which is the exact same treatment we give to the remaining Pawmot. Losing Atraxa here was really rough, since I wanted to bring it into the final fight versus Maxie. Instead, I'll have to make do with Pokemon that are still alive. In this ultimate battle versus the leader of Team Uwu, who unlike his counterpart in Base Emerald, captures Groudon in a Master Ball and instantly adds it to his team. Yeah, we're in really big trouble. Not only did Maxie just add Groudon to his team, we have to face him in a double battle. This means the return of Glarb, who can fake out Incineroar to make it flinch before we Hydra Steam Hawlucha below half health. The bird wastes a turn by setting up Swords Dance since we can outspeed it the next turn with a held Choice Scarf to take it out. Glarb then outspeeds Incineroar and gets a hefty chunk of damage off with close combat. Incin hits both of my Pokemon with Bulldoze to lower my speed before Maxie sends in his Specs Chi-Yu. I still want Glarb for fake out utility, so I swap into Zinnia, who gets off off and Intimidate. With the Choice Scarf, Ghalta outspeeds Chi-Yu even after the speed drop, taking it down to about 20%, which unfortunately isn't quite enough to stop it from Dark Pulsing Zinnia into oblivion. Incineroar then goes for another Bulldoze, which ironically just decimates his own Chi-Yu. I then send back in Glarb as Maxie sends out Cacturn. Glarb fake out said Cactus as Ghalta finishes off Incineroar. Mega Camerupt comes in next, and Glarb outspeeds everything, taking out Cacturn with a close combat. Despite being at -2, we obviously outspeed Mega Camerupt and instantly take it out with a quad-effective Hydro Steam. This makes Maxie's only remaining Pokemon his Primal Groudon. The only KO this thing sees is against Glarb, so I take the turn to swap Ghalta out into Lulu and get whatever pathetic damage I can with Bullet Punch before getting wrecked by a Fire Punch. The reason I didn't switch to Ceruledge here is this could have easily just been Precipice Blades and it would have immediately died, so instead I let Glarb go and go for Dragon Darts with Miram to get as much damage as I can before both of my Pokemon get hit by Precipice Blades. High Roll crit would take out Miram here, and it does end up getting the high roll. Thankfully it doesn't crit though, and Lulu can finish off the Groudon with a big counter. Sure, we lost Glarb and Zinnia, but at least we don't have to deal with Team Magma ever again. After we humiliate Maxie, Groudon escapes from its Master Ball and goes on a wild rampage. This leads us to Seafloor Cavern, where we've got to take on Team Aqua in a very similar way. Before we get to fight Archie in a double battle, we've got to take on both admins back to back with 4 Pokemon each. The admin fights go a lot better than versus Team Magma, where I basically make it through the first fight versus Shelly without any problems whatsoever. The second fight versus Matt is slightly sketchier. I U-turn out of Swellow to take care of Frostlass with Shorakai. I then swap to Purphoros against Machamp, who can only get hit by Thunder Punch, which I can weaken severely by just going for Will-O-Wisp. I then switch Meowscarada into a Surf against Greninja, which gets one-shot by a Flower Trick. Against Big D, I make sure to go for U-turn to break its multiscale as I swap out into Shorakai. Dragonite doesn't see KO with Earthquake here, so it sets up with Dragon Dance to boost its attack and speed before I hit it with double Iron Bash, which sadly isn't quite enough to take it out, bringing it deep into the red. At this point, we are dead to Earthquake, so I can safely swap in Ishai, who finishes the job with a Guts-boosted Quick Attack. Overall, that went so much better than versus Team Magma, but we still got the boss to worry about. Archie then captures and adds Kyogre to his team right before our eyes and challenges us to another double battle. Unfortunately, I don't have Glarb to use Fake Out, so I added Delcatty to the team, whose hidden ability is basically huge power but for special attacks. I also gave Miram a Choice Scarf and changed it to a special attacking set. This is because it's the only Pokemon I own that can actually outspeed Iron Bundle after the Quirk Drive boost with a held Choice Scarf. Ironically, it's because of Golurk's No Guard that I'm not worried about missing Thunder or Sleep Powder when I put Golurk to sleep. Mega Sharpedo comes out next, and expecting an Aqua Jet into Miram, I swap out into Miri. Obviously, this isn't a good enough reason to swap out since I resist Aqua Jet. I make the switch just in case Golurk wakes up, which it ends up doing since Miri's immune to Ghost-type moves. Giga Drain also does enough to Sharpedo where I can just take it out with a Fake Out before putting Golurk back to sleep the following turn. Quackable comes out fourth, and I start the turn by Mega Evolving Venusaur. This is where Delcatty's hidden ability comes in handy. With Feline Prowess, we double our special attack stat, giving Thunderbolt more than enough damage to one-shot Quackable. I then get some damage on Golurk with Giga Drain before Archie sends in his Kyogre. Primal Kyogre's base speed of 90 is the exact same as Delcatty's. This means if I stay in, whoever gets to move first will be a speed tie. There's really nothing I want to swap into a Primal Kyogre, so I decide to just go for it. Unfortunately, I end up losing this coin flip, and Miri goes down without dealing any damage. Shrufus does about 45% with a Giga Drain, and I send in Aleela. I use Volbeat to Encore Kyogre and lock it into Ice Beam. Because of Mega Venusaur's Thick Fat, this never kills either of my Pokemon, even with a critical hit. Another Giga Drain from Venusaur takes Kyogre down into the red, and as Golurk wakes up, I thought I was losing Aleela to a Headlong Rush, but it actually just targets Venusaur, which survives an Ice Beam even after the Headlong Rush because of Thick Fat, meaning Shrufus gets to stick around and take out Golurk with a Giga Drain after Volbeat zaps Kyogre. Archie's final Pokemon is Electros, so I swap into Thrasios and Detect as the Electros goes for Flamethrower. I then use Encore to lock it into Flamethrower, which basically seals the deal since neither of my Pokemon are dead to crit Flamethrower. Both of my Pokemon outspeed Electros, so I go for a Thunderbolt to take Electros below half and finish the job with a Liquidation, which means we never have to deal with Team Aqua ever again. But if you thought that means we're out of trouble, you'd be sadly mistaken. After Kyogre escapes from Archie, I go to Sootopolis City, where Wallace tells me Rayquaza's the only Pokemon that can stop Kyogre and Groudon's fighting. He urges me to go to Sky Pillar to find Rayquaza, but once I get there, I find out that Drake has beaten me to it. For former Elite Four member Drake has been an agent of chaos in the background this whole time so he could get his hands on Rayquaza. Let's dance, Mustache Man. Just like Archie and Maxie, Drake challenges us to a double battle, and he's got by far the most oppressive team we've seen. I lead with Polt and Kangaskhan since they can both dodge Intimidate with Clear Body and Scrappy respectively. I then Mega Evolve, which switches my ability to Parental Bond. Kangaskhan then fakes out Magearna so that Polt doesn't get killed by a Moonblast the same turn we knock out Salamence with Dragon Darts. After Salamence, Drake sends out Archaludon. Both of Drake's Pokemon C kills into Miram, so I swap out with U-Turn and send in Tatiova. Kangaskhan then hits Magearna with a Fire Punch, which deals over half with a Parental Bond. Archaludon then whiffs the Draco Meteor, and Magearna hits me with a Dazzling Gleam that doesn't quite do half to either of my Pokemon. Archaludon sees a KO with Electroshock here, so I swap out into the GOAT, Volbeat. Kangaskhan then takes out Magearna before it gets to make its move, and finally at the end of the turn, Archaludon gets to use its Electroshot. This is normally a 2-turn move, where you raise your special attack the first turn and attack the second, but with a held Power Herb, Archaludon gets to attack the same turn, which doesn't do too much as a resisted hit into Aleela. I then get some leftovers recovery, and Drake sends out Tauros to get me intimidated. Tauros most likely goes for close combat here, so I swap out into Miram and then go for Encore to lock Archaludon into Electroshot. And because it doesn't have its Power Herb anymore, it just wastes the turn boosting its special attack. I start the next turn by detecting with Aleela and going for Will-O-Wisp with Miram to have the attack of Tauros. Volbeat then protects itself from Rock Slide, and unfortunately Miram is the one that gets hit by the Electroshot. It thankfully doesn't take Dragapult out, but it would have been way better if it shot it into Volbeat's Detect. Sick of being encored, Drake swaps out Archaludon and sends in Gouging Fire, which gets an attack boost from Photosynthesis as soon as it comes in. Miram U-turns out into Elishnorn, and Tauros hits me with a Wave Crash. I don't want to take out the nerfed Tauros, so I just launch a Thunderbolt against Gouging Fire, which barely does anything. The following turn, I fake out the Entei Triceratops and go for an Encore to lock Tauros into Wave Crash, basically stopping it from going for close combat against Elishnorn. Drake hates this plan, so he swaps out Tauros and sends back in Archaludon. Aleela detects since I don't want to get hit by another Wave Crash, and I lock Kangaskhan into Outrage, hoping it would take out Gouging Fire, but I deal a good chunk of damage to Archaludon instead. I use Moonlight to heal back up with Prankster, and this time Outrage actually hits Gouging Fire, which is enough to take it out. Archaludon goes for Draco Meteor, but after Moonlight, Aleela manages to survive. Kangaskhan gets confused after 2 turns of Outrage, but I can't exactly afford to swap out at this point since Drake sends in his Mega Rayquaza. And in this case, Aleela being at such low health is actually pretty good. The enemy AI is very likely to try and take out Aleela since she's so close to going down. So I go for a Detect, and just in case Kangaskhan gets attacked, I try for a Sucker Punch and actually break through confusion. Both Archaludon and Rayquaza target Aleela, so I don't take any damage this turn. The only mon I can reasonably swap in here is Tatiova. She eats Rayquaza's Dragon Pulse, and honestly, I just left Kangaskhan in here to die. I wasn't expecting her to break out of confusion and decimate Rayquaza with an Outrage. After that sigh of relief, Archaludon tries to hit Tatiova with a Draco Meteor before Drake sends out his final Pokemon Tauros. And honestly, I couldn't tell you why it close combats Primarina instead of the normal type Kangaskhan. I'm certainly not complaining since I get to Outrage Archaludon, which hurls a Draco Meteor at Elishnorn, who's somehow still alive. Tatiova ends the turn by going for a flip turn, swapping out into Specs Typhlosion, who can finish off Archaludon with Priority Flamethrower. Sadly, despite all the craziness, I don't actually manage to get through the fight deathless, and we lose Elishnorn. Take your well-deserved rest, Kangaskhan. Because he's at full HP, Typhlosion still gets priority with his Fire-type moves and knocks out Typhlosion with a Flamethrower. I was super afraid that the run would end going into this fight, but what do I ever have to fear with Volbeat by my side? With Drake defeated, Rayquaza escapes its Master Ball and flies off to Sootopolis City. This magical serpent with a very suspicious gum-to-tooth ratio is the only being that can stop the fighting between Kyogre and Groudon. Finally, we've put an end to the schemes of the evil teams and can get back to our gym journey. The final gym battle is versus Juan, who's forsaken his water types in favor of fairies. He leads with Tapu Fini, which we can pretty reliably counter by just Mega Evolving our starter to gain Thick Fat. This way, we take way less damage from Ice Beam, reducing it to less than a quarter. Giga Drain then gains us all that health we lost back and does more than half to Tapu Fini. The exact same thing happens the following turn, turn, gaining me back all the way to full HP as I take out Juan's lead. Specs Fluttermane is by far the biggest threat, but because it has choice specs, it immediately locks itself into Psyshock, causing Juan to switch out when he's unable to hit Arabo. I send in Lulu to fight Rapidash, who takes a play rough on the switch. After that, Donphan's still able to survive a critical hit Flare Blitz, so I can safely stay in and knock out Rapidash with an Earthquake. Diancie comes out next, so I swap into the Grand Arbiter as Juan Mega Evolves. A Moonblast merely tickles my Empoleon, so Juan elects to set up with Calm Mind, which is too little too late since a quad-effective Flash Cannon is still enough to take Diancie out even after it's at +1. I can't stay in against Ursaluna, so I swap in Venusaur, who takes a ton of damage from a Headlong Rush. Thankfully, Ursaluna is super slow, and after the -1 to its special defense from Headlong Rush, Giga Drain does a ton of damage, getting me almost all the way back to full HP. It's enough healing to where I'd comfortably survive a crit return, so I take out Ursaluna with another Giga Drain, which brings out Fluttermane again. With the health I get back from Giga Drain, this is always Psyshock, so I can safely swap in Arabo. This time, Juan doesn't even bother to save his Fluttermane by swapping it out, so I get to knock it out for free with a couple of Night Slashes. The final mon of the final gym is Tinkaton, and I've saved Perforos in the back for exactly this purpose. The only move Tinkaton can actually damage me with is Stone Edge, which is why I've given Perforos a Charty Berry to discourage Tinkaton from using it. My plan works, causing Tinkaton to go for Gigaton Hammer, which allows me to finish the fight with a Bitter Blade. And with the final gym badge added to our collection, there's only one place to go. With all the Hoenn badges collected, I make my way to Evergrande City. Here we've got the option to fight Volkner, which would give us Rising Voltage and Zeraora, but with one look at how stacked his team is, this definitely isn't a risk I should take. But that doesn't leave us in the clear just yet. Before we get to enter Victory Road, we've got to fight both of our rivals. The good thing is, we've been beating these gals consistently throughout the entire run. Most of May's Pokemon are a piece of cake. We take down Crobat with Shorakai, bait the close combat from Urshifu, allowing us to pivot through Perforos to send in Arabo on a Wicked Blow. From there, a Stab Play Rough takes out Urshifu, and we swap to Shrufus to deal with Milotic. Lulu takes a little bit too much damage from Metagross, but still manages to finish the job. From here, it's just Tapu Bulu and Mega Blaziken. The former gets completely walled by Perforos, and Blaziken starts scaring me a bit by setting up with Bulk Up. After taking a scary amount of damage from a Thunder Punch, I start swapping between Perforos and Lulu since Blaziken can never do anything to either of them if I do. I do this until Donphan is at full HP to reactivate Sturdy, and then finish Blaziken off with an Earthquake. That's it for May, now we just gotta take care of Dawn. The only really scary Pokemon on Dawn's team is Blacephalon. Donphan walls her Iron Boulder, and Empoleon walls her Empoleon, which brings in Blacephalon. To deal with it, I pivot into Perforos to dodge a Mind Blown. This causes Blacephalon to lose half of its health, and I then switch into Arabo, who always survives a Shadow Ball. From there, we simply outspeed and take care of it with a super effective Night Slash, and her Noivern and Meowscarada are easily handled by Assault Vest Shorakai. By defeating Dawn, May gives us the legendary Kubfu. We now get access to Victory Road, which consists of a gauntlet of 7 trainers. As long as I make it past these guys, I can say that I made it to the Elite Four of Pokemon Emerald Imperium. Wally's first, but the poor guy immediately swaps out of his Sneasler into Shaman when I was just going for Ice Shard to break its Focus Sash. This switch just loses him his Shaman Sky on the spot, and I kind of feel sorry for the guy. With Lulu at full health, I can just stay in against Mega Gardevoir and deal a ton of damage with Earthquake. Psychic is the only thing that kills here, so I can safely swap in Arabo and finish Gardevoir off with U-Turn. As he sends in Raging Bolt, I can swap in Thrasios, who's holding an Assault Vest. Things get a little bit sketchy when Raging Bolt gets a critical hit, since Swampert can't take it out with a single Earthquake. I basically just have to risk a crit here, and thankfully Thrasios survives. Sheer Force Life Orb Darmanitan is always a pain to deal with, but Galta doesn't care about anything this thing can do and cleans things up with a Surf. For Sneasel, I send back out Lulu, who tanks a close combat, brings it down to its sash with an Earthquake, and finishes it off with an Ice Shard. For Celesteela, I've got Mega Empoleon D, who can tank hits for days, and eventually finish off the fight. Wally is by far the most challenging trainer in Victory Road, mostly because all the cool trainers only have 4 Pokemon each. This makes them much easier to plan for, since you could just bring 2 counters for difficult Pokemon. Despite that, however, I still managed to fall short of a KO with Water Shuriken and lose Flubs to a Mag Cargo. Sorry, Flubs, you definitely deserved better. Not exactly my proudest moment on display right there, but at least beating this cool trainer means that we made it all the way to the end of Victory Road. All we've got to do now is decide which Pokemon we're bringing to the Elite Four. With 2 possible teams chosen at random for the first 3 Elite Four members, it's pretty hard to plan. So I start by heading to Sootopolis City and hatch a Fire Egg into Litten. Even though Incineroar's one of the best, it isn't quite the starter I'm looking for, so I head to Pacifidlog where I hatch a Score Bunny. Another great one, but what I'm actually looking for, I end up hatching on Route 130, a Chimchar. With nearly 80 hours clocked in the game, I started making my endgame calculations, which added a few more hours to the timer before I'd finished selecting my final team. With so many possible opposing teams, we've got to bring very versatile Pokemon. Meowscarada's speed and ability to change type makes it a no-brainer. Primarina's the only fairy type in my possession, and we're definitely gonna need one for all the dragons. And speaking of dragons, we're definitely bringing Polt for its super speed and ghost typing. Melmetal's here to be our physical wall, and Empoleon joins Primarina for our special defense. I'm also bringing our newest recruit Infernape as our main damage dealer with its insane Mega Evolution. With one step through these doors, there's no going back. It's time for the Pokemon Emerald Imperium Elite Four. Just like in Radical Red, the first 3 Elite Four members have 2 possible teams. Sidney leads with Galarian Moltres either way, so there's no way to tell what team he has yet. They do feature different movesets, so you could find out which team it is by letting Moltres hit you, but I'm not planning to give this bird the time of day. Either of them would be holding a Focus Sash, so I break it with a Fake Out before taking it out with close combat. Victini shows me that this is Sidney's Trick Room team, and even with Kibo at -1 defense, Victini can't one-shot with Zen Headbutt, so I'm expecting it to set up his Trick Room. Now that I'm slower, I pivot out into a Rabo to dodge the Zen Headbutt. I realize I could have spared Miram some health here by giving a Rabo Sucker Punch, but either way, Miram can always survive a critical hit V-Create, making this a slightly less optimal but still perfectly safe line of play. With Priority Sucker Punch, we don't care about being slower, and even with a Rabo, we'd be baiting out Grimmsnarl. Mega Grimmsnarl has a crazy special attack set of base 145, so I make sure to slap an Assault Vest on Tatiova, who's then comfortably able to knock out Grimmsnarl with a couple of Moonblasts. This baits out Sidney's Poison-type Monkey Dory, so I swap out into Shurikai to dodge the Sludge Wave. The worst thing Monkey Dory can do to Melmetal is a resisted Psychic, so I pick up an easy KO with a couple of Earthquakes. At this point, Sidney only has 2 Pokemon left, and Guzzlord really doesn't threaten Shurikai even with its super effective Earthquake. Guzzlord's gotta be one of the worst Pokemon designs of all time, so it was pretty satisfying to double Iron Bash its face in. Absol's only productive move here is close combat, so I pivot into Miram, who is dead to Sucker Punch. But Sucker Punch only works if you attack, giving me a completely free switch into a Rabo, who can put down the Disaster Doggo with a single super effective Play Rough. Sorry, Sidney, but you lost my respect the minute I saw that Mohawk. Phoebe's 2 teams are incredibly different, and if she would have led with Dragapult, I'd have to swap to Melmetal immediately. The Weezing team is a much better matchup for us, which is why I prepared so much more for the other team. Focus Sash Calyrex Shadow is a nightmare compared to Lunala, not to mention Shadow Tag Mega Gengar, which would have been another headache. This team is much simpler, and we only really need to be careful around Mega Dusknoir. After torching Weezing with an Adaptability Overheat, I U-turn out against Lunala to break its Shadow Shield. The U-turn damage does just enough so Lunala doesn't get back to full HP after Leftovers recovery. A Rabo gets to swap in for free against the Psyshock and can finish Lunala off the next turn with a Choice Banded Night Slash. This team also has Pheasantipity instead of Annihilate, which is much easier to deal with. The worst thing it can do to Shurikai is Double Kick. We're seeing Double Kick in the Elite Four. Annihilate would have been a genuine issue, whereas Pheasantipity just gets dropped by a single double Iron Bash. Drifblim is another Pokemon that we way prefer to the alternative, which is Sniper Scope Lens Drapion. The first Shadow Ball doesn't get a crit, meaning we can always survive another. Melmetal's Iron Fist boosted Ice Punch isn't quite enough to take Drifblim out, but since we don't care about activating Unburden, since we're always slower anyway, it doesn't really matter, and we drop it with a second Ice Punch. Dusknoir is next, and this thing's Mega Evolution is extremely dangerous. With 150 to both of its defenses and 105 base HP, this thing is really tricky to take down. I was hoping for an Earthquake against Miram, but end up getting burned by Will-O-Wisp, so I U-turn out into a Rabo to take the Poltergeist. Mega Dusknoir gains the Dark typing, meaning it's only weak to Fairy, and I'd love to just launch a Play Rough here, but with its massive defense, I can't actually take it out in one hit, so I'm forced to go for Night Slash instead of Play Rough since I don't want Protean to change me into a Fairy type, because that would leave me vulnerable to a crit. Patching my ability to Overgrow before the fight was an option, but then I wouldn't have Protean for the other team possibility, which I was much more scared of. Another great way to deal with it would just be to not have a held item on Dragapult. That would make it immune to Poltergeist, but we'd run into a similar issue where I'd just have a nerfed Dragapult if I were facing the other team. Thankfully, Tatiova comes in clutch in a way that I didn't anticipate. Even after the Earthquake damage on the switch, Tatiova can't be taken out in one hit. This causes Dusknoir to start spamming Amnesia with priority because of Prankster. And while this reduces my Moonblast damage by quite a lot, by the time Dusknoir gets to +6, my 3 prior Moonblasts have put it in range of a 4th one just taking it out, and with this one, I simply outspeed since it's not using a non-damaging move. Phoebe's final Pokemon is Pecharunt, and we've got a completely free switch here into Augustin the 4th as it goes for a poison move. After failing to do good damage and watching me heal back up with leftovers, Pecharunt speeds up its own demise by going for Parting Shot, which gives me a +2 to my special attack because of competitive. I certainly got lucky with Phoebe's choice of team, but with Glacia, I wasn't quite as fortunate. George R.R. Martin fan Glacia comes at you with either a team of Ice or Fire. Mega Infernape runs circles around the Snow team, so I was pretty bummed to see Sun. In the case of a Alolan Ninetales, an adaptability Overheat would quickly turn it to dust. But even with Mega Infernape's impressive 137 attack stat, it doesn't quite have enough power to one-shot Ninetales with an Earthquake. So I've got to do this little dance where I swap into a Rabo against a Psyshock and go for U-turn to get that chip damage, then pivot through Tatiova to make sure I take an Energy Ball instead of Flamethrower, which does a lot less damage and also wastes a turn of Sun before I can swap back in, Mega Evolve, and take it out with an Earthquake. On both her Hail and Sun team, Glacia always has Darmanitan and Volcanion. Obviously, it's much worse to face them in the Sun because of their stab Fire-type moves. That makes my first priority to get rid of the Sun. I start by swapping in Tatiova, whose Assault Vest reduces the damage of Hydro Steam. This gives me another free wasted Sun turn as I swap Augustin into a Sludge Wave. After protecting, I only need to take 1 Flamethrower in the Sun. Critical hit plus burn here doesn't quite take me out, but it would possibly lose me the run. This turn sees the end of the Sunlight, and with a Protect right afterwards, I get all the way back up to full HP. With Volcanion's Water Absorb, we can't rely on stab moves to deal any damage, and we're still taking a ton of damage from Flamethrower, so I start by setting up a Calm Mind. This would reduce the damage of the next Flamethrower, but we instantly get crit and taken down to 21 HP, which I thankfully heal back up with a Roost. I'm forced to then go for another Roost to get me back to full HP. The next Flamethrower thankfully doesn't crit, only doing about 25% as I set up my second Calm Mind. Obviously, we could be hitting this thing with something like Earthquake, but my best damaging option is actually Grass Knot, which gets boosted by my Calm Mind and actually deals a pretty impressive amount of damage to Volcanion because of its chunky weight. The amount of Flamethrowers we've got to take to pull off this strategy does put us at risk of being double crit, which would probably just end the run. Galarian Darmanitan Zen Mode is the other big threat with its 160 attack and 135 base speed. By holding an Air Balloon, Miram is immune to the Earthquake as I swap in, and I can outspeed and U-turn into Kibo, guaranteeing that I'm not hit by a super effective Earthquake. This also baits the always non-lethal Icicle Crash, making it entirely safe to come in and take out Darmanitan with an Earthquake. The damage from U-turn doesn't matter whatsoever because of Galarian Darmanitan Zen Mode's pitiful defenses, and once Glacia sends out Reshiram, I can swap into Tatiova. With the Assault Vest and no active Sun, Primarina barely takes any damage from a Fusion Flare, giving us more than enough wiggle room to take out Reshiram with 3 Moonblasts. Unfortunately, from here, we're in big trouble since a lot of our Pokemon have taken really a lot of damage, and we now have to deal with Mega Charizard Y, once again setting up the Sun. On the bright side, Charizard is unable to hold a Heat Rock because of its Megastone. I'm then able to waste the first of 5 Sun turns by sending in Shurikai. A Protect waits out the second Sun turn, and this is where things get risky. To come out of this fight with all my team members intact, I now need to dodge 3 crits in a row. Tatiova survives the first, and I was really hoping Charizard would go for Solar Beam here, but Flamethrower means we have to dodge a crit. Doing so gives us the chance to Protect to get rid of the final turn of Sun. This means Kibo is now not dead to Flamethrower. However, this is where I leave the run in the hands of a crit for the 3rd time. I never recommend you use a strategy that relies on you dodging 3 crits in a row, but by the point Charizard came out, I was hard steering. Luck is not your friend in these games, and I'm at least not taking another risk with Rock Slide since they changed the accuracy to 100%. With only 6 HP remaining, I can't stay in against Decidueye because of Sucker Punch. Thankfully, I still have Meowscarada waiting in the back for exactly this interaction, who's able to one-shot Decidueye with a Play Rough. If I lost a Pokemon to Glacia, allowing me to bring in Infernape for free, I'd still be super super proud of myself for getting this far, because Dawn and the Sinnoh gym leaders aren't the only visitors from the region. Someone had to replace Drake, but why did it have to be the strongest champion of all time? Frankly, I never expected to get this far, but with all my team members still alive, we might actually stand a chance. Cynthia, as usual, leads with her classic Spiritomb, which in this game lowers my attack with Intimidate. Despite that attack drop, a stab play rough because of Protean still does over half to the collection of spirits. Spiritomb can't really do much to a fairy type, but the worst thing that could happen is that we get put to sleep by Dark Hole. In case that would have happened, I made sure to give a Robbo a Chesto Berry, and Cynthia, realizing it's game over for Spiritomb, goes for a cheeky Sucker Punch to get some damage in before Spiritomb goes down. She then brings in one of her two main powerhouses, Zamazenta. This thing's one of the strongest Pokemon in the game, and honestly, I wouldn't even feel that bad if I just lost to this thing on the spot. To try and avoid that outcome, however, I concocted somewhat of a plan. Shorakai always baits Body Press or Iron Defense. This way, I can swap in Miram for free, who's holding a Roselli Berry, so Zamazenta can't take me out with Play Rough. Managing to land my Will-O-Wisp basically means we don't need to worry about Zamazenta, but as I plan to swap in Shorakai again with a U-turn, Cynthia just hard switches into Heatran, giving me the offensive momentum and letting me pop its air balloon. Cynthia isn't too keen to give up her Heatran to an Earthquake, so she swaps in Garchomp as I Mega Evolve my Infernape. Based on the damage I do with Earthquake, I probably could have stayed in and just gone for Adaptability Close Combat, but I've got a plan for this Garchomp. With a held air balloon, Empoleon can swap into Earthquake, resisting all of Garchomp's other attacking moves. Cynthia doesn't seem too happy about that arrangement though, swapping into Cramorant to eat an Ice Beam. Empoleon completely walls this thing, but I don't want to lose my air balloon, so I swap out into Tatiova. Just like Empoleon, Primarina pretty much completely walls this thing, and it only takes a few Moonblasts to take it out. With Cramorant down, she sends back out Garchomp, and I go for Protect to guarantee it wants to Earthquake and to get a little bit of leftovers recovery before swapping in Empoleon again. But Cynthia just doesn't want to take the bait and swaps in the biggest threat on her team, Xerneas. After my Ice Beam, I could stay in next turn and try to go for Make It Rain, but because Geomancy boosts its special defense, I swap in Shorakai instead. As I switch in, Xerneas goes for Power Herb Geomancy to double its special attack, special defense, and speed. With its other moves being Psyshock and Moonblast, Xerneas' best bet is to go for the super effective Hidden Power Fire. But with a held Assault Vest and Shorakai's massive HP stat, I'm guaranteed to never die to a crit and can take out Xerneas with a super effective double Iron Bash. It was an unbelievable relief to not have to deal with possibly the strongest legendary in the game anymore, but hey, you gotta respect a fellow antlery boy. I swap back in Empoleon against Garchomp, and Cynthia finally bites the bullet, realizing she's never gonna win this matchup. To break my air balloon, she's forced to go for Scale Shot, giving me a guaranteed Ice Beam to knock out the Garchomp. Zamazenta comes back in, so I swap out into Miram to dodge a Body Press. Zamazenta's a defensive behemoth, and I don't have any good way of dealing damage to this thing. That being said, Cynthia has no way of getting HP back for this thing either. Empoleon baits Body Press, so I can always safely swap in Miram. From there, Empoleon or Melmetal don't really care if it goes for Play Rough, Body Press, or Iron Defense, creating a loop where I'm basically not taking any damage whatsoever, while Zamazenta is slowly but surely chipped down by Burn at the end of every single turn. Finally, Cynthia's down to her last Pokemon Heatran, and with Flamethrower, Power Gem, and Flash Cannon, I can easily swap in Kibo, who doesn't even need to use Fake Out to destroy Heatran's air balloon since we already broke it earlier with a U-turn from Pulse. From there, it's a simple quad-effective Earthquake, and somehow we've made it past Cynthia. If we would have lost a Pokemon against Glacia, we could have maybe survived Cynthia if it were Meow or Primarina. But with all of our team members still alive, here I stand in front of the champion. Or rather, in this Hoenn, Wallace and Steven are open about their love, meaning we've got to take them on both at once. This champion fight is crazy, featuring both Radical Red's Primal Dialga and a new Primal Palkia. We also have to start the fight by fighting both versions of Mega Empoleon. Having made it this far, I was ready to do near anything to make it to the end. And because Wallace and Steven count as two separate trainers, I knew exactly what I had to do. If we can knock out all of one champion's Pokemon, it'll come down to a 2v1. I'm much more afraid of Steven's team in the back, and his Mega Empoleon doesn't have too great damage output, so I start by targeting targeting Wallace. His Mega Empoleon trades in its defensive stats for speed and attack, making it super easy to knock it out with an adaptability close combat. From here, I don't want to take the other Empoleon out, so I just go for a low kick to deal some damage. At the end of the turn, Steven sets up Stealth Rock as Wallace sends in his Palkia. With its primal armor, it reduces the damage of super effective moves by 50%. Infernape just dropped its defenses with close combat, so I swap into Tatiova, hoping to dodge either a Hydro Pump or be completely immune to Spatial Rend. I just need to get damage on Palkia, so I go for a Play Rough and dodge the Spatial Rend with Tatiova. Empoleon roars out Meowscarada at the end of the turn, sending back in Kibo, who takes some damage from Stealth Rock. This works out pretty well, since Kibo can flinch Palkia with a Fake Out, giving Tatiova a free turn to deal a massive amount of damage with a Specs Moonblast. Empoleon just roars again, this time swapping Infernape out for Empoleon. I get the Rocks damage back from leftovers and immediately swap Empoleon out for Polt. I didn't want Empoleon to get hit by Earth Power, but it turns out Palkia just targets Tatiova, who shrugs off the Earth Power fairly comfortably and takes out Primal Dialga with a Moonblast. With Wallace's biggest threat defeated, Empoleon uses Roar again at the end of the turn to swap out Polt for Melmetal. Wallace is now down to his final Pokemon Suicune, so I swap in Meowscarada. This is admittedly a bit of a gamble, since I really don't want it to be roared out at the end of the turn. Suicune takes the turn to set up with Calm Mind, and I go for a Body Press just to get a bit of damage. Empoleon does end up roaring out Shorakai, sending back in Tatiova. The next turn, I go for a Flower Trick, hoping Shorakai's Body Press was enough to put Suicune in range, but it just barely survives. I was afraid an Ice Beam would be enough to just take a Rabo out here, but Suicune wastes the turn by going for another Calm Mind, allowing Tatiova to take it out with Moonblast. With that KO, we've completed the first phase of the plan to knock out Wallace. Empoleon just keeps roaring, this time sending back in Infernape. I start by going for Fake Out just to get a little bit more damage with Low Kick. I want to still have access to Fake Out later in the fight, so I swap in my own Empoleon before Rabo takes Stevens out. This brings out his Metagross, so I start by going for U-turn and swapping in Shorakai. Metagross goes for the predictable Zen Headbutt on the switch as I fail to get a burn with Scald. Without any good options to hit Steel types, he continues going for Zen Headbutt, which ends up flinching Shorakai. This kinda works out for me though, since Shorakai can easily sponge the hits, while Empoleon takes out Metagross with Scald. Somehow I'd managed to make it to the final Pokemon of Emerald Imperium. All that was left to do was to defeat Primal Dialga. I wasn't sure if this thing was gonna Fire Blast or Aura Sphere, so my safest bet was to just stay in and let Shorakai go. Thanks for everything, buddy, you were nuts. There's not much Empoleon can do to this thing, but I didn't want to risk a switch, so I just go for a Scald. I next send back out Kibo and go for a Fake Out Scald combo just to get as much damage as possible. Adaptability Close Combat is nerfed by Primal Armor, but I still managed to get Dialga into the red. Sadly, it doesn't quite put it in range of a Scald, so Kibo gets blasted back to the beginning of time. I send out a Rabo to finish things with one last low kick, and as I watched Dialga fall, I realized I'd actually done it. I'd managed to avoid those crits versus Glacia, and because of it I beat a Pokemon Imperium Hardcore Nuzlocke. If one of those crits would have landed, I likely wouldn't have made it to the end of what's become my favorite ROM hack. There's something beautiful about going into the Elite Four where 5 of your 6 Pokemon are guaranteed encounters. This game offers fantastic Pokemon on pretty much every single route, but even if you feel like you're not quite up to the Nuzlocke challenge, I definitely recommend checking it out. And hey, if watching a 75-minute video all the way to the end can't get you to subscribe, I don't know what to do.